And we're crossing to Canberra for, we actually have two sort of local open source heroes in this session. And the first one is Andrew Tridgell, better known as Tridge, who is known for a lot of things. Initially, I guess it was Samba, which was an open source implementation of file servers serving Microsoft's SMB remote file system protocol. And the impressive achievement there was Samba running on Linux had much better performance for serving SMB file systems than Microsoft's own implementation. And in the process of doing this, he also developed a tool called rsync for keeping remote disk repositories in sync. I use it daily. And this is actually what he got his PhD for, not for Samba. And he's one of the real constants of the Australian open source scene, in particular the LCS conference, etc. More recently, he's got very much into drones. His software is flown on autonomous aerial vehicles in various places, which he found quite scary, if I remember. And his talk today, though, is not about drones. It is about open source, FOSS, and I really apologize for not having the topics in front of me. FOSS over the years, so that's free and open source software over the years. And Tridge, you here?
Yep.
Then over to you.
Thanks very much, Godot. All right, so thank you very much, and I really feel privileged to be here. The list of speakers is absolutely fantastic, and I've enjoyed every one of them today. And there's looks to be some great ones coming after mine. So we'll have this little low point in between where I'll chat a little bit. So I thought I'd look a bit at sort of how I started with getting into this area of technology. And given that one of the speakers coming up later today is Andy Tannenbaum, an absolute titan in the industry, I thought I should dig around. And one of the first things that sort of got me into this technology area was as a student at the University of Sydney in the 80s. I had installed Unix on a PC, and it was around 1988. And 1998, I'm sorry. And I just so happens that I actually found the old discs. So I tend to sort of keep old bits of technology. I'm a real pack rat for keeping things. So in fact, I've got the full stack of install discs for that version of Unix that I installed way back then. And so I thought I'd show them off. And it was really, that got me started along the sort of technology that I ended up in. So it also helped me learn a little bit of the basics of the Unix command line, which, as you'll see in the next slide, actually was quite important for my path towards starting Samba. So the next little bit that I'll tell you about, and this was when I became a Unix sysadmin, and I actually didn't study computer science. I did first year computer science, but then I studied physics. And so I was in theoretical physics, and I was doing honours in theoretical physics at the Australian National University in Canberra. And they had a DECstation 3100 running Ultrix. And this was in 1989. And so in my first few days there, I needed to get an account on this machine called AeroDec. This was the DECstation. And the academic who was in charge of the machine was struggling to create my account and couldn't work out how to create the account and set my name, etc., my room number, that sort of thing. So I offered to help out, and I found the manual for Ultrix sitting on the shelf, and I looked it up and worked out how to create my account. And so he then told me, well, okay, you're the sysadmin for the year. And so that's how I became a Unix sysadmin in theoretical physics at ANU. And the really nice thing was just recently, I'm friends with John Magdog Hall, a well-known figure in the Linux community. And John happened to post something that led to a bit of a story coming out. So John has a friend, Lisa Sanford Crane, who wrote those manuals, those Ultrix manuals. And so finally, after all these years, sort of more than 30 years later, I've got to virtually meet the person who wrote the manual that allowed me to work out how to create an account so that I became a Unix sysadmin on a Ultrix machine. And that was also important because that machine was running Pathworks. And when I first wrote Samba, what I thought I was doing was actually implementing Pathworks. Little did I know it was actually the SMB protocol. But anyway, I started off working in the area of free and open source software. It was just, known as software, but anyways, in those days, or free software. I contributed a mouse driver and some AppleTalk fixes to the NCSA Telnet program during that year when I was an admin in the university. And I really enjoyed the process of contributing to that open code. So I don't know how many of you have used NCSA Telnet. NCSA is, of course, very well known for NCSA Mosaic, the National Center for Supercomputer Applications. I think it's in Illinois. But Telnet was the one that everyone used in order to connect to the larger computers around the university, at least at ANU, and I think at many universities around the world. And so, of course, I was using it, and I was relegated to a Mac for part of my time there, and so worked on the AppleTalk driver to make that work, and also wrote a mouse driver for PCs when I started getting a PC on my desk. So that was a sort of an interesting, story behind how I became a sysadmin and got into this area of technology. So then, starting Samba. What later became Samba, and it wasn't called Samba, first of all, the very first name of what later became Samba was actually just called Server. And, I struggle to this day with naming projects. So a lot of them have fairly boring names. But anyway, it was called Server at first. It went through several names, but we finally settled on Samba, which by the way, that name was chosen using egrep against userdict words on a Sun 4.1 system by finding all words with S and M and B in that order. And we're very lucky that I didn't end up developing Salmonberry, which was the only other choice in the rather limited dictionary on that Sun machine. Anyway, so I was a great procrastinator, and I've actually given lectures on the art of procrastination and how to do constructive procrastination, because I find that procrastinate. I'm not a procrastinator that goes and plays computer games or, reads novels and things. When I procrastinate, I tend to do something productive, just not what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I worked on a lot of different software while I was a student. And one of the first major pieces of procrastination was the project that became Samba. And as I mentioned before, I thought I was implementing Pathworks because I was trying to make something that worked with Pathworks, and this is because DEC was offering free licenses for this X Windows system for Windows if people would do beta testing, give feedback. And I thought, great, I can go and do beta testing for this product I don't need as a great way of procrastinating. And so then I needed, the Pathworks system didn't use the same TCP stack under Windows as PCNFS did, so I couldn't talk to the NFS servers in the department, so I couldn't get my email or any of my data. So I thought, okay, I will implement Pathworks for the Unix systems that the department had, and that will allow me to then talk, and that way I can keep doing the procrastination while actually, testing out this product that I didn't really need. And that's how I ended up writing a Pathworks server, which was quite by accident later that discovered that actually this protocol was a protocol that Microsoft used called SMB. Then the name of the project changed and it sort of grew a bit. Anyway, the technique for developing this protocol is very different from the sort of techniques that you've heard from the fantastic software engineers that are the other speakers today. So like the speech by Butler was fantastic on how to do things right with designing software from specifications and implementing things really properly. So in this case, I was implementing a network protocol for which there was no spec, and I had to invent new techniques for what I called network analysis, or is often known as reverse engineering. And so the techniques were rather interesting. And there was a time some years later when I had to explain these techniques to a room full of European judges. And this was for the Microsoft European Commission antitrust case, which dragged on for, would you believe, 10 years. I went over to Europe twice to testify in that case. And this is where the European Commission was trying to ensure that Microsoft actually did release specifications for their protocols. So I needed to explain to all these judges and the court, how I'd developed Samba. So I came up with this analogy, the French cafe technique of network analysis. And I given a complete separate talk on this if you want to go in the gory details, but the idea is that, if there weren't any books on French and no schools on French, how would you learn it? Well, you could go and sit in a French cafe, and then you could try doing things, try mimicking what other people did in the cafe. You could try poking somebody and see what they did. You could try, going and, putting some nasty flavor in somebody's coffee and see how they react. That's sort of the network equivalent of injecting packets and seeing responses and following error paths through code to work out how a protocol works. And that's really the sort of technique that was used, which is very different from the type of really refined software engineering that is normally associated with creating a widely used piece of software. And these days, of course, we've got, we do have the specifications. That lawsuit was won by the European Commission, and very proud of the part that the Samba team played in that. And so we actually have incredibly detailed documentation available. And in many ways, the project was less fun after that. The process of learning the protocol by experimenting on a Windows server as like a guinea pig was massively fun for someone like myself. And yes, anyway, it's moved on a bit, and the software engineering techniques used in the Samba project now are much more akin to the type you would see taught in universities and normal programming courses. So the Samba project sort of grew through mailing lists and Usenet postings, and I'm talking about this because as I was putting this talk together, a very vague title I gave Gurno about FOSS over the years. You can hang just about anything on that. And I ended up actually focusing in on an aspect of free and open source software development, which I'm quite passionate about. And this is the importance of communication and communication techniques and communication channels in the world of free software, and why the communication is so important. So I'll be talking a bit about the various communication channels. So in the early days of Samba, it was basically there was a mailing list, there was Usenet postings, and that's really the way we communicated. And it really is a very successful way of communicating, and many free software projects still center less around Usenet, but more about, still a lot of them center around mailing lists and IRC and similar types of technologies. So anyway, my foray into free software development eventually became a full-time career, and this was largely luck in that. If you may remember, if you're around in that era, in the late 90s, there was a sudden sea change in the perception of free software, and particularly anything that had any vague relationship to Linux, where it went from ashamed that they were running their products on Linux or using free software to, companies that really they might have had one little Linux server in the corner and they'd make a press release about it because it would drive their stock price up. And there was this incredible and quite irrational change in the world around that time. And I was like a junior lecturer at the ANU at the time, and like a level I academic. And I decided that I'd go for a trip over to Silicon Valley, which seemed to be where, a lot of this stuff around free software was centering. And I gave some talks on what I was doing with Samba. And I went along to four companies and gave talks about what I was doing. And I was amazed to find that, all four actually offered me jobs. And I was particularly amazed because what I was saying was, well, I'd love to work on Samba full time. I'd love you to pay me to do it. And I want to own the copyright to everything I do. And I want to do it from home back in Australia remotely. And I get to choose what I work on. And such was the era that such a ridiculous proposition was accepted by everyone that I spoke to, and they made me job offers, which I was quite astounded at. I was expecting to come home empty-handed. And I started off by working for Linux Care and worked for various companies over there at times, just working remotely, working on Samba full-time. And it really was, the dream job to be able to just, live the dream of working on free software full-time. And we really developed a very rich open community, heavily oriented around the Samba mailing list, multiple mailing lists, a lot of stuff on IRC, on the Samba technical IRC channel. And we started having regular conferences. So an annual developer, particularly there was one in Germany that was really fantastic that we'd had on a regular basis. Plus, we had, of course, LCA, where a bunch of Samba team members would tend to get together at the Linux Conference Australia. And that was sort of the Southern Hemisphere version of the Samba conference when we got together there. So just sort of covering large amounts of time and, in a fairly fast period because the limited time in this talk, I was constantly procrastinating and ended up producing a whole lot of different projects. Actually, I think I started 25 free software projects during the 8 years of my PhD, much to the frustration of many of the people at the university who thought I should be writing a thesis instead of writing these bits of code, and included things like rsync and Ccache and other ones like that. I got started with ArduPilot, the ArduPilot project in 2011 as a hobby and yet more opportunity for procrastination. And it became an obsession very quickly. Started off on 8-bit microcontrollers. We're now typically running on STM32, but also run on Linux. So there's quite a few Linux-based vehicles out there running ArduPilot, but the vast majority running little STM32 microcontrollers. And so I actually ended up in 2012 retiring from working on Samba. I was working full-time on Samba at IBM at the time, and moved on to working full-time on ArduPilot. And ArduPilot has really grown to be a really large, vibrant project with very wide commercial usage. There's huge numbers of commercial drones out there flying ArduPilot, as well as a very rich community of hobbyist developers. And I love that blend in a project of both the hobbyist user and the commercial user. The commercial users provide fantastic nuanced feedback on trying to make stuff really, really reliable. And the enthusiasm of the hobbyist users is absolutely brilliant and incredibly infectious. So that blending of that in free software projects, I love. If you ever get a chance to work on a free software project that does mix those two, it's incredibly rewarding. So it didn't involve much reverse engineering, but I can tell you that crash logs take on a whole new meaning when you're flying an aircraft at 100 kilometers an hour and something goes wrong. And the photo down here in the bottom right of the slide, that's a picture of my dining room table from a couple of years ago, and it's not much better today. And it shocks some visitors, they wonder how my wife puts up with it. But my wife has a corner of the room as well where she does her hobbies. And so we think it's wonderful. But it has become quite an obsession, and my entire house is full of pieces of drones these days. That's a quad plane in case that's a quad plane in case you don't know. So that's a fixed wing plane that also takes off vertically, which is one of my favorites. All right, so moving on to what the real sort of theme of what I want to talk about today, the importance of communication. And in the world of free and open source software, really communication is king. And relating it back to sort of what has prompted this entire series of lectures today, John Lyon's commentary, his commentary was really an act enabling communication. There was this source code which was available to people, but to people in isolation because of the licensing terms. And it wasn't available to the community for communicating about the code. And what he did was he enabled that communication through the commentary with everyone having this common reference. And it's a pity I don't have a copy here to hold up. And I think that is, it's often called, you know, it was an open source action that John took. And I think that in the sense that it was enabling the types of communication that are vital to free software development, I think that's very true. If you look at the four freedoms as the GNU project and the Free Software Foundation, their way of defining what free software is, you know, the freedom to run the program, to study it, to redistribute, and to give your modified versions to others, a lot of that is about freedom of communication and freedom to communicate about the source code and participate actively in open communities without boundaries that other developers and users with similar interests can share your passion for the source code by communicating directly about the code. And that's what's missing in so much proprietary software development. And I think it is often a misunderstood aspect of free software, just how important the ability to communicate about the code is. So what is it that makes FOSS different? And is the directness of the communication paths that I think is absolutely critical. As a developer in pretty much all of the projects, I think all of the projects that I've been involved with, I had direct interaction with end users. And that's something which is not common in much of the proprietary software world. So I deliberately go out of my way to talk directly to end users. And when they ask me, you know, why it does this, why it does that, I often might link them to a line of the code. Oh, it has that property because of this. And then they may not be a programmer. I explain what that means, you know, why that it works the way it does. Maybe it should work a different way, and we might open an issue, and the user might volunteer to test a change, look at the change behavior. So that direct user to developer communication is the hallmark of free software development, and it's fantastically powerful. The second communication path that's also important is from developer to potential developer. And it strikes me, I've been helping out companies sometimes, companies that are running ArduPilot or running other free software that I've worked on. I help sometimes to interview, you know, potential new developers at the company. And it's also refreshing when to be interviewing somebody and to be able to openly discuss the code, show lines of code, because the project itself is completely open. The exact version of the code that that company is running is there that they can browse if any developer wants to. And it's such a different experience from when a developer might interview at a company in like Microsoft or IBM or others that are running, you know, primarily building proprietary code. And the experience then is you're sort of, you know, you might know vaguely what they're working on, but you really don't know whether the code you're going to be, you know, dedicating the next several years of your life to is a pile of rubbish, or whether it's actually well structured and you enjoy working on it. You just have to take the word of the interviewer, and you might have quite different taste in code. Plus, not having to give up the code when you move on. So many people in the free software world, they work, you know, whether it's paid or unpaid, work on the code for years and years, and they develop a passion for that code and want to keep working on it. We see that again and again, and they find ways, even if, you know, the company they're working with on it no longer exists, they find a way to keep working on the code. And that type of relationship with the code, relationship with other developers, is absolutely fantastic. It's incredibly rewarding. So on the other side of the coin, things that sort of kill these communication paths. The big one is things like non-disclosure agreements. And it really is so disheartening, you know, to be working on a piece of code that's under a non-disclosure agreement and not be able to reveal the contents and discuss it with other people, to talk to others at the local Linux user group or friends at the local flying field, you know, to discuss it with colleagues with similar interests, to ring up somebody that I haven't worked with for years that I happen to know has an expertise in an area, and ask his opinion on a particular way of solving a problem. NDAs are just awful killjoys for that type of experience. And yet they're the norm in the proprietary software world. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about the relationship between free software community and academia a bit later in the talk. But unfortunately, NDAs are becoming depressingly common in academia, and sometimes are even covering bits of free software development, which I think is a great shame. And I think there needs to be a greater appreciation within the developer community exactly how stifling, how much developer friction these types of legal agreements have. And it's the old debate on, for example, you know, do you require that developers sign over copyright to the project when they're making a contribution to free software project? And I've generally erred on the side of not requiring that, even though I understand the legal reasons why it can be good, because of the friction that it provides. But that friction is amplified oh so much when you have an NDA covering the code that you're working on. You can't discuss it with other people. There's a little thing that I thought of many years ago, and I don't know whether it's a saying that I got from someone else or whether I made it up myself, but it's something I remind myself of commonly. And it is this, that no matter who is in the room with you, there is someone smarter outside the room. And that's something that is really also important to remember, to not get an arrogance about your own abilities, to realize that, you know, even if you have expertise in UAVs or in network protocols or whatever, be open to the idea that you'll run across people that know more than you, you know, on the problem you're working on. And one of the main things you want to do in the world of free software is to find those people, converse with them, and learn from them. And it's a constant journey, you know, learning more. And I find it wonderful meeting people who are able to point out the error of ideas I've had that I thought were just rock solid for years and years and years. And somebody asks a simple question, I realize, oh God, I've been doing it wrong for the last 20 years. You need to be open to that. And so that's that little phrase that I remember, you know, there's always somebody smarter outside the room. There's always new people you can learn from. And the photo I've got here, this is from the 2011 Brisbane Linux Conference Australia. And this is just in what is commonly called the hallway track. And that's me in the green t-shirt sitting there and learning from somebody. And really these sorts of hallway tracks and this inter-developer communication and being able to pull out your laptop and whip open the code that you're working on and show it around to all these other people that, you know, many of which you've never met before. And them saying, oh, you should try this, and get a link to some other code that gives you an idea. It's just a wonderful world to be in. Free software developers really have it good in the ability to interact with other developers and learn from so many people, and not be restricted to be within the narrow confines of some corporate environment. So this is something that I think is very important for project leaders to understand, what I call the developer funnel. Users become lurkers when they can see the dev process. You've got these sort of users, then lurkers, then contributors, then developers, then eventually project leaders. And a role as project leader is to guide people through that funnel, to find the users that can potentially, you know, become developers of the future. And they lurk around until they get enough confidence to start a tiny contribution, and you encourage that contribution through good feedback, and they become developers. And then some of those developers become project leaders. You need to remember, even when talking to a person just starting out, they've just started to use this bit of software you're working on, they know very little about it, that person you're talking to, that it's often called a newbie, that person may be the project leader of the future of your project. And you need to keep that in mind and relate to them as potential project leader material of the future. And that's what leads to projects being successful and living, you know, a good, being really long-lived projects that can really survive, you know, through the passing of different project leaders. So the role of mentoring, incredibly important. It's not restricted just behind the corporate veil. It's incredibly important for encouraging new developers. I love the Google Samba of Code project, Google Samba of Code, you know, idea. And we just started. I've got a student who's just starting now that we're having our kickoff meeting just in the next couple of days. And hello to Will, if you see this talk. So the projects like that are absolutely fantastic. And I've mentored hundreds of developers over the years, over 30 odd years of development. And it's incredibly rewarding to mentor people through the process of them making their first commit to. Many of the people I've mentored have ended up in full-time careers in free software. And some of them I've ended up hiring into companies that I work for, or I end up you know, building very, very strong relationships with them over the years. And there's 3 of them there in this photo, actually 4 of them. We've got Volker there, and Alexander and Chris and Raphael, members of the Samba team that I was involved with mentoring over the years. This is at a plug fest where we were testing out interoperability with Microsoft in Seattle. And they'd all come in from all over the world for this plug fest, and people that are proud to be friends, as well as people that I've mentored. And that mentoring process is oh so important. So I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So I've got just the one final slide where I'll talk a bit about the relationship with universities. And this is something, a bit of a worrying trend. In the early days, free software really thrived in university environments. I think particularly in Australia. I think there was something about the Australian university environment that really encouraged free software development in a fantastic manner. We saw a lot of great projects come out in Australia. There was very close relationship between academic researchers interacting closely with FOSS projects. And I think that relationship is in a bit of danger at the moment. I've noticed over the past 5-10 years, there's been a real change in the relationship with universities. And we're now seeing more NDAs in use. We've got things like fear of others publishing first, discouraging discussion, walled garden tools like Microsoft Teams within universities, preventing external interactions or hindering it. And I think we need to find a way to revive this relationship. So I think if you're from an academic institution, try and think about how we can improve that. Maybe publishing source code needs to be actually a consideration, much like publishing in journals is considered, towards people's career paths in academia. Because I think it'd be a great shame, it'll be long-term damage if we can't keep this relationship going. All right, back to you, Gunnar.
All right, thank you very much, Tridge. And because I'm sort of a university guy here, I have to respond to your last issue with NDAs. Totally I'm certainly totally on your side with respect to, particularly when we do publicly funded work. And even if we do commercially funded work, there's always public support here. And we should really be very suspicious of anything that requires us to write code which we can't publish, and just as we shouldn't do anything we can't publish academically. But having said that, I think NDAs are not necessarily bad. I enter NDAs all the time. But everything we do is open source. Often it just helps us talking to people in a company and really understand their requirements. To me, that was the reason why I even got a security clearance once. It's now expired. it was too much effort to go through and try to extend it. But it allows me to talk to people without barriers and really understand where they're coming from, what they really need, and then be able to condense that into a design that can be implemented in open source. So I wouldn't poo-poo them too much, but I definitely understand where you're coming and appreciate where you're coming from. So we have a few questions here. One is sort of had to happen. How did it feel to watch Microsoft SMB implementation to have a CVE leading to a WannaCry while Samba didn't?
Well, I mean, we've had plenty of CVEs in Samba. I'm no longer an active developer in the Samba community, by the way. So, although many of the bugs that are discovered these days had their root in code that I wrote many years ago. So the bug might be my fault, but I'm no longer responsible for fixing it, which is a rather nice position to be in. I mean, yes, Microsoft has had some nasty bugs over the years, and but so has Samba. There's been plenty of Samba CVEs, and the open nature of free software can really help in security, but it's not a complete panacea. And I feel sympathy for proprietary developers, even Microsoft developers, when they have security errors like that, they have to panic to fix. There's a nice little thing that, hey, we weren't vulnerable, but I know that the next one we might be.
Yeah, and I mean, I totally agree with the statement that open source helps, but it's not a panacea. The open SSL bugs that been hiding in plain daylight for years is a case in point, right? Just because it's open doesn't mean it's really necessarily more secure.
That's right. Test suites are more important.
But there is sort of different aspects to that. One question here focuses on that one. Features tend to be held from FOSS versions of products. So this is presumably about dual licensing code where you have a proprietary and an open license. To prevent exposure, a bit like BitKeeper removed its free version, what are the security implications? That sort of goes in the same line as the previous statement, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the, some projects have had like delayed release type of things, and there's been some quite famous ones over the year where they release an older version, but if you pay for it, you get the newer version. I don't like that because it breaks the communication path between potential developers and it sort of creates this walled garden of those who are in the know. So I'm not a fan of that, and none of the projects I've got do that type of thing. My code tends to be the day I write it, I commit it to a public repository. I far prefer that, and I think it leads to better code. I know people do it for various commercial reasons, but I think that it's possible to create... You're paying a very big price for that in terms of engagement with potential developers, and it's not really along the lines of taking advantage of the true free software spirit. As far as the security implications of that, essentially that next version is proprietary. And so it has the same security implications, and that's mostly around a bit of sloppiness. They might lead the security audit of the code to be, at the point where they're releasing it publicly when they're worried people might find things. So it might lead to a bit of sloppiness, but it doesn't have to. It is possible to create secure proprietary code. It might be uncommon, but it is, I believe, possible.
Thanks. There's an interesting one. You talked a lot about reverse engineering, and Samba wasn't your only case. I remember the big fallout you had with Linux.
Yep.
That led to Linux implementing Git. So there's a question that relates to that. Do you think reverse engineering being ethical or unethical, and why?
Oh, I don't think it's unethical at all. I think that, so now I should say, by the way, that I haven't been involved with projects doing things like disassembly. And I always obey the license. So, in that case of the BitKeeper one, I never, never agreed to that license for BitKeeper, and I was never bound by it, and I wasn't a user of BitKeeper. I was working at over the network, and it was very easy to work it over the network because Larry had designed it to be easy. You know, there was a help, right? You telnet to it and type help, and you got information about the protocol. You know, you could actually just then Google a couple of the terms that came up, and in fact, you got lots of details about the protocol if you on open public web pages. So that's been all a bit blown out of proportion. There wasn't a lot of reverse engineering in the sense of what I did with Samba involved in that. There was a bit with some of the data structures involved, but you know, really it was a walk in the park compared to what we were doing with the Microsoft.
Remember your LCA talk on it?
Yeah, that's right. It was trivial by comparison. Anyway, so I don't find it unethical, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do to you know, re-implement things. And mostly what I've been doing is re-implementing existing protocols to be compatible. And I think actually it's just socially responsible to make something that's compatible with an existing system so that you're not, you know, you're not leaving this horrible decision for users about lock-in and then losing all their data and, you know, if they come over to an alternative system. And I'm glad to see now that companies like Microsoft have very much embraced, you know, open source. They're very happy to work with the Samba team, and they welcome us at yearly, you know, events and things, and they've seen the light. And they've, you know, we're no longer a cancer, we're now, you know, friends. Which is great. So I'm glad that at least in that particular example that things have turned the corner.
Not a question, but a comment. My first GPL contribution was Solaris quota code for Samba. It's still there and it's current form based. Thanks for making the process simple. That's from Peter Urbanek.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution. I love all the number of people who contributed over the years. It's just fantastic, and it's great meeting them. So thank you very much.
There's still a large number of questions, but we're running out of time, so I apologize for not being able to go through all of them. I imagine Tridgell might be open to answering them offline, but we have to move on here. So thank you very much for your exciting talk here, Tridgell.
Thank you, Gino. Thank you, everyone.